Hi, this is Abdul Bhartia, and welcome to 2020 and our first episode of TFI Wrap, presented by Racken. And today, once again, we have with us Rob. Rob, welcome to 2020. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing great. I'm excited about the new year. It's going to be a crazy ride, I think, for everybody.
I think it's already, the way things are happening around the globe, not only in the software world. CES is going on. Samsung is getting into, cars and all. Sony is getting into cars, and Samsung is getting into VR. So it's crazy world. And in the open source world also, it started with the OSI. One of their co-founder actually they resigned. He resigned, Bruce
Yeah.
Perms, over a new license. And I want to talk about that today. What do you think?
I love talking about open source licensing and technology. It's an industry in crisis, and it's definitely something that I enjoy sort of chewing on to figure out what people can do about it.
So the whole issue is around a new license that was submitted. It was a cryptographic autonomy license, which was I think submitted by Van Lindenberg, who was a lawyer. And there are a lot of stories going on because Bruce resigned because there was a lot of accusations of lobbying behind the scene. And then, some people came in support of Van, Matt Ashe, one of the most respected bloggers and, technologists out there. He said he trusts Van a lot. So I have a lot of mixed feelings about this whole fiasco. But what we are not talking
Yeah.
about, we are talking about the whole process, whether there's lobby, that's all accusation. What we're not talking about is what is this license all about? What problem Van saw in the market that he thinks needs to be solved? Because as we have seen with the cloud, vendors, a lot of database companies are trying to add some clause to their own licenses. So as the whole open source landscape has evolved from the time of when Richard Stallman created his GNU GPL version 2 and then 3. I mean, there was version 3 that came out to solve one particular problem. So I think it's about time that we may need more licenses or which are compatible with OSI. So I want to understand from your perspective, first of all, what you think about this license itself, and then what is
Yeah.
actually critical here versus all the noise.
Boy, there's a lot of it, and for people, they should understand my history with open source is deep. I was one of the founding board members of the OpenStack Foundation, and so I rode that train for quite a while and watched as we struggled with exactly these types of issues, and we had a lot of conversations with that. And Racken itself builds our products with open source, and our product is offered in a way that creates an open source ecosystem around our core platform. So we pay a lot of attention to what these issues are, and we get people asking us a lot of time why we're not open source. And I think our conversation will maybe answer some of those questions for people indirectly. The challenge, the license we're talking about in this case is actually pretty interesting, and people should also understand what the OSI's role is in all these positions, right? There's a lot of open source licenses. You don't need OSI to come up with a new license for you. You can just write your own license. But the OSI has been sort of this bastion of the most open of open license proponents. So there's a lot of sort of what ended up being political positions about how open source should be worked that the OSI takes and mounts. And so there's a whole bunch of, are they helping commercial entities, or are they working against commercial entities? What are their interests? How is the market evolving? Which we should talk about. And the license you're talking about specifically is one that's related to blockchain type technologies, where you actually can have blockchains can include the code, actually do include the code that are part of the blockchain. And so as you modify the blockchain, you're actually modifying the code in the blockchain. And so that license is more to sort of a walking license that confers or conveys with the blockchain. And so it creates some different license challenges where you sort of have this evolving license model. And so I know they were trying to figure out some type of additional license model or additional conveyance requirement that would be carried in a blockchain or crypto style model. So a more peer-to-peer license than what we've traditionally had, which is sort of a author protects the software or a foundation protects the software with certain governance rules. It's a really different model.
Have you read the PDF of the license that Van submitted or not yet?
I have not gone through the details of the license. I've been trying to catch up on the synopses from that perspective.
Right.
My lawyering foo is not strong enough to necessarily worry about some of the details. Although one of the big complaints of this change was that it required people to become lawyers effectively to use the license. And I think one of the challenges with any of these licenses is that most people don't read them. Right? I've read the APL and the GPL licenses, the MIT licenses, the dog food license. There's a coffee cup license, which is by the author coffee if you see them. And so, the goal with a lot of these licenses, they should be very easy to understand. And one of the challenges with really anything blockchain is that it isn't easy to understand. And that was a big complaint with this model, is that if you're creating licenses that are complex and hard to maintain, you're opening everybody up for lawsuits. And if people remember, right, one of the things that really marked the 90s and the early aughts on licenses was you would just get plain sued if you used open source technology because it wasn't clear what the ownership was. These are very real problems. I don't want to dismiss it by saying, oh, we're not lawyering enough. These are very real problems. And then lately we've had real serious commercial issues because the SaaS marketplace has really allowed these licenses to be used in ways that people hadn't envisioned when they were written.
Right. I was talking to Linus Torvalds, and of course he said he was not a huge fan of lawyers for a specific reason. And one of the reasons when you look at whether Apache license or BSD licenses or OSI approved licenses or GNU GPL, the language is very simple. It's just 5 or 6 clauses that you read, and it's like it's human readable format. It's not a machine readable or lawyer readable format. You can read it and you very clearly understand what you can or cannot do. And that is one of the reasons why people were able to get involved with open source. They were able to release their own because there was nothing like if or but, that okay, if I with this license, as one of the concerns that Bruce had was that as you also mentioned, that you actually need a lawyer to consult before getting involved with that. And that, in my personal opinion, that defies the whole purpose of open source, where, you don't have to worry about these things. Read the license. And Linux, a lot of people, at one point, Linux decided to release Linux under a different license. And there are so many different licenses that you would not even know what would be the implications. As you said, you will get sued up at some point. So then he finally settled down on GNU GPL version 2. And that is what every project is doing. Apache version 2, there's no complexity. You read the license, you know what you can or cannot do, your users who are derivative of your work can or cannot do. So that is a legit concern there.
So it is, and although I think a lot of people don't actually understand how the GPL, which is one of the cornerstone licenses for Linux, the cornerstone license actually works, and the requirements to share code and be part of a community, right? This to me is the fundamental problem. If we strip back away from the licenses, and the reason why we're seeing so many providers, what had been open source providers, changing their license, is the goal for these licenses was that people improving the software code base would share those changes back into the community, and we would have community development, right? There was one side of it is sort of, I want to be a hacker in the sense that I want to be able to change and modify and fit things to my system, which is an individual use where you're modifying. But in a lot of cases over the last 10 years, we've really seen open source become more of a business license, or attempt to be a business license. But it's structured in a way that says, I can make changes. I can take your source code. I can make changes that fit my needs and then not share them back to you or not share them back into the community. And when that happens, it really violates the core tenet of improving the ecosystem, improving the software. So if I was writing a software platform and people took my code, used the license to create a variant of it or run their business on it, right, and then didn't give anything back into the sustaining of that software, you're fundamentally violating the community spirit, if you will, if not the economics of the whole model. And that's, I think, what we've been seeing. We're seeing people who have really invested very hard in building shared community infrastructure, and then a tragedy of the commons where people are taking from the community without putting anything back into it, whether it's money, whether it's code contributions, whether it's publicity. And you can't eat publicity. So while it's great to have fans, talking about how great your software product is, that doesn't necessarily translate into commercial success or sustaining the software that people use. And these licenses, not to go on too long of a rant on this, but the licenses have to be structured in a way that reinforce sustaining the software that people are consuming. And I think fundamentally this is what we're looking at as a challenge. Even down into this new OSI debate, if the question becomes, how do you sustain the software that you're building a license for?
You earlier said, a lot of people don't understand the GPL to some extent, and as people start to understand it and they try to bring it closer to their business, they actually tend to move away from it.
GPL is considered toxic by a lot of companies because it has a requirement that you share and contribute. You tell people that you're using the software that you're using, that you share and contribute changes back to the community that you've made. And if you embed it in a product, the GPL says you have to show everything that you build on top of a GPL product. If you're modifying that code, then you need to contribute that back upstream. It's been one of the things that made Linux very successful.
So, but let's come back to this because this whole fiasco has created some, raised some serious concerns, genuine concerns. One was, I was actually reading some tweets. One was from Madash, and he said, he trusts Van a lot. So the license that he wrote, it should be trusted. I don't agree with that view. No disrespect for Matt or Van, but I don't trust Linus. I trust the process that Linus has set up for kernel, development. We trust that process. The total transparency is there. If trust was the reason, almost none of the open source projects will have any governance model. If you talk about any open source project, Netflix last year when they released Spinnaker and they put in CNCF, and I talked to them, and their first concern was to build a very sustainable governance model around it, so that companies who are touching Spinnaker, they know that this is not controlled by Google or Netflix. So every project, they strive to create a governance model.
They tried at least.
Yeah, because now it's part of Linux Foundation, and of course Linux Foundation has a very good processes there. So most of the projects, when you talk to, they talk about governance models. So because they don't want to be the sole. It defies the whole purpose of putting your project in open source, because you want contributors from around the globe, to work on it. Here, what we're looking at, trust this guy. And no offenses, no disrespect, but that's not how open source works. It works on the processes, not the person. Otherwise, you'll say, hey, you know what? This project is owned and controlled by Microsoft. We all love and trust Microsoft. Let's use it. No, Microsoft will make sure that there's a governance model there. So what do you think about that?
I think you're right in principle, but not in practice. My experience with open source, and this is true in just life, right? There are people who have outsized influences in a lot of these communities and can have very significant impacts, right? The accusation of Van basically doing a walking quorum to get something through, and walking quorum is a technical term for running any type of board where you have members of the board who are basically setting up a vote in advance. You don't want to do that, but discussing lobbying and things like that, those are human activities.
No, that point I totally agree with. Even if you look at any project, when I talk to Linus also about it, it's not everything happened publicly. A lot of discussions, you have to just sit down and convince. You're not so.
It actually can raise concerns in open communities if you have too much fighting or tension in a right. You don't want you want people to have disagreements. There is a community process. I 100% agree. Right. This is Linus going back to saying all bugs are shallow in the community. Right. So the idea is that if one of the values of community software is that you have a lot of eyes, you have a lot of people doing that work. That it should be able to distribute that load. In practice, sadly, that isn't the way a lot of things work, right? A lot of these platforms are incredibly complex. People's ability to really make a significant difference to a platform is very limited, and then the sustaining requirement of test and validation to make sure that any changes made to the platform, that is serious burdens that have a cost, right? And a lot of times people doing sustaining changes or fixing bugs into a core of any of these platforms, there's repercussions that don't matter to them specifically. It becomes a community maintenance project. And so there's a lot of things to balance in these questions. So I think when we look at, it's easy to say, oh, the community is very amorphous. But when it comes to actually doing a legal document or lawyering a new license or figuring that out, it's still going to be a couple of people with hopefully a lot of eyeballs on the reviews. And it still comes down to individuals doing the work, individuals having trust, individuals having a reputation for it. That doesn't mean we don't trust, we don't verify the work. That's the entire point of these community processes. And one of the things that's worth noting, right? Open source processes with open pull requests and chain of auth and having a 2-person review cycle and a public commentary and all those things have become amazingly powerful tools in software as a whole, right? We are using open community processes now in corporate development because they're great processes that encourage good software development practice. And they're out of this idea that I have people who might have different objectives, different needs, that I can't trust as deeply, and so I need to verify and validate their work. But at the same time, you're going to have to come back to somebody who really understands the subject matter to be able to push something through. I've been in way too many open source meetings where the room was 60% people who had just shown up that day and didn't have any history and any background and had their share of opinions on what was going to go on without any of the history, and that's disruptive, and it slows down the process. That doesn't mean those new opinions aren't good and useful, but it's very hard to develop software where you have a lot of seagulls in your process.
The second point I wanted to discuss with you, you did touch upon was, as I said, no offenses to anybody, but we trust open source more because of the processes and the trust in the community, not an individual person. Because it's not about if some, the biggest thing that we always keep hearing is, what is XYZ get hit by a bus, What if when Linux gets hit by, what will happen to? So the focus is never on a person. It can be like, a lot of projects, people keep moving on. And then they get burnt out and things like that. So that's why we always move it to the processes or governance model. So same is the case here also. So you do have to trust the person who's doing it, but at times that person himself or herself says that, hey, don't trust me. Trust the processes that we have put in place so that the project is sustainable.
And that's, to me, the thing that really has been transformative over the last 20 years around open source, because the processes have really impacted how we generate information technologies as a whole, right? We rely on open source in a ton of places, but people don't realize to what extent, something like GitHub, which is Git, based on this core Linux technologies of how to do shared collaborative development. But that is the core thing in this case. What you're describing as process, I consider collaborative development. And process is hard. I think we oversimplify this and we talk about open source and license. You're right. The process is a critical component of how all this stuff works, and the transparencies, how we resolve issues, threat of forks, the ability to create your own components. But it's very hard. It's very human. It's very messy. And it's, at some point you do have to make a decision, in or out. And that's what all these processes do. I love that we're actually having the conversations around licenses as around lines of code, but the Linux, the open source community has really learned how to have, process, description, license, legals. All these things are now part of these ongoing processes. You're right. Linux Foundation deserves a lot of credit for helping promote these processes. But I actually think that as a global community, we've really changed the way we think about how we build things together and what a collaborative process looks like. And that's thanks to the open source communities and the way we do things in the open, which is, I think, very healthy until it's not. But that's not an open source or a not open source thing. Just like the license challenges that we're having across the industry now with open source things are actually much more about SaaS and IT outsourcing of operations and using clouds to change the operational experience of software. That's the trend line that's going here. It's not a license problem.
The kind of reaction this submission received, what kind of message it sends out to those database companies who were thinking about, maybe working with OSI to come with something which might be compliant with existing open source, because they may be monitoring very closely that how the actual open source community reacts and responds, because some changes are needed, no matter whether you like it or not like it. We do have to work on licenses. But so it's either like it's a very welcoming community, where, okay, we will have a debate about it and we'll see whether the license, but suddenly, somebody's resigning from the board to build a public pressure that, hey, we will not accept this kind of license. So what message does it send? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the welcoming community is an accurate statement. And that's fundamentally the message in this case. But I want to pull back a little bit from this, because there's a ton of people who are like, no, open source is welcoming, damn it. And what's amazing to me is the open source communities are amazing. The people are amazing. They want to collaborate. They are friendly. And without a doubt, I absolutely love being in open source communities, and I'm in them all the time. It's interesting. I go to commercial communities also, or vendor related communities, and they're also welcoming and friendly and excited to talk to you and collaborate. It's not something that's in the open source coffee at the conferences and not somewhere else. This is what people do. I think that OSI, oh boy, there's layers here. So the database software companies, right, that we've seen, it's not just database software companies. The companies that are trying to do commercial open source and figure out how to protect their licenses from being used by a competitor who doesn't contribute back in the community or doesn't work collaboratively with them, is a fundamental problem in the industry that we're going to have to address by license changes. And the companies that are having that problem have stopped waiting on the OSI to have leadership here, because the OSI's position has hardened into, it's open, damn it. It's free, damn it. And I get it. That is their position. It's how they're structured. It's what they want to do. And I think that it's very good for us to have people in the industry who are like, no, I believe in really pure open source technologies. However, I think that position and the extreme of that position has made it very hard for companies who are trying to be more of a collaborative open source environment and make money and sustain their product and create a healthy ecosystem around their product. I think that position has put them in a challenge where they're like, wait a second, I have competitors with me taking my code and using it against me. I have customers who are taking my code and not paying me for it, not sustaining that code. It puts companies in a very big bind, because this is, the community process needs to make sure that the community is sustained. And while we're talking about a tempest in a teacup, if you will, over a license, I think it's very real issues. Licenses are funny like that. They're just a document, but they are components that give us indications of a broader challenge in the market, where people are not finding that open source licenses are working for the creators the way that we had thought they would. We need to think through what that license looks like to protect the people who are creating the software. I was Erica Windish actually was going back and forth about this exact issue on Twitter, and saying we need to have a license that protects the creators. The creators of the software need to have their needs met in this process, whether it's for food and shelter, or it's for what actually respecting the work that they're doing. Those are really important questions that we need to be looking fundamentally at the license. And so I'm a little sad on the OSI, right? They're trying to bring in new licenses. They're doing the right job that they're supposed to do, and figure these things out. I don't feel like we have a place to have this conversation. They're not leading the commercial dilemma here, and it's been forcing companies to go out and basically create their own licenses from that perspective, which is going to lead to chaos.
It's ironic that you would say that because one of the reasons OSI or open source was created, it was created, as a marketing for free software, because free software as a term or FSF position was kind of to push corporate players away. So it was open source was created in a way to make it easier for open source to be used and consumed by commercial players so that they can use. I think OSI should have taken actually a very proactive stand here.
I think that it's hard. What I've
But
seen
they
is
had
that
only
people.
one job.
So I think that they've retreated to their corner, which is the challenge here, which is that open software should be open, and that is the position that they're going to take. And so I think that we've had this challenge where people who are deeply in the open source communities and want all software to be open, which is an admirable statement, have a tendency to say, if you can't figure out the business model to make the open software work, it's on you. And I think we've seen enough challenges right now that's just not the case. We need to stop blaming the creators of the open source software who are having trouble making it succeed commercially. We need to stop blaming them for their challenges in the success. We need to come back and look at the license model and question the system as the problem. And to me, this is where the challenge is in the market right now. We have people who believe so deeply in open source software, and I was one of them, and it took me a lot of being kicked upside the head on commercial challenges to recognize this, right? I was an open source apologist from that perspective. You have to come back and say, this is a system-wide problem for the industry. I know we want open source software to work. I know we want people to pay for it. I know we want the creators to be rewarded. If they're saying consistently that they're not, then we have to come back and say, all right, wait, what's wrong with this system? I think OSI believes that they have an answer. They have the right answer in this. And so it's very hard for them to come back and say, wait a second, maybe we have to question some fundamental beliefs about what's going on here. That's really healthy, but it's very, very hard to do. And one of the things that sort of is a trend line with open source projects and communities is that they have a tendency to be very religious about the positions they've taken, the way they've built their software and what they're doing and why they're doing it. And then from that perspective, be committed all the way in, and they'll ride that project straight in, even if it stops working from that perspective. And that's human nature. It's not unique to open source projects, but we see that all the time, and that's what creates a fork, if you will. And maybe it's time for some of these licenses to fork. I would say that's what we're seeing commercially. With these companies that have created their own versions of the license. We have a whole bunch of forks right now, and probably in a year or two we're going to see some consolidation back. The bigger fork, by the way, in my opinion here, is that you don't do open source, you run a SaaS business. That is the dominant way people have gotten around open source licenses. Is they're just saying, I'm not actually going to offer my software anymore, except in a way that I control access to its IP. And so I have a bigger concern about the software industry because of these challenges.
If you could just step back a bit, OSI has actually, is leaning towards approving it. It's, Bruce Perns who is objecting, and he has stepped down. So if you look at OSI as a body, they have actually agreed to kind of grant this license. So it's a few, going to the point of, that we'll see more licenses, and that's what created a lot of chaos at some point, that you did not even know whether they're compatible or not. And but at the same time, when you look at the SaaS model, which seems like middle, not everybody can afford to have a SaaS model. It's very easy to develop software and offer it as a download, and people pay you the subscription fees to support it. But it takes a lot of infrastructure to and then you will be tying up with AWS, and then in 2 years AWS will offer same functionality, and you will be out of business. So.
I would tell you as a software company that it's actually easier to offer the SaaS and control what's going on in the SaaS than have individuals downloading your software into their environments and trying to make it work. Right? I think the lack of friction around SaaS offerings is real. And as a software industry, we're not chasing the right targets when things are so hard to support, right? It's let me be very specific here. If we offered our software as a SaaS, we'd have one version, we'd maintain that one version, and people could use it. Doesn't work for RackN's model where it's behind the firewall. That's the actual problem we solve is behind the software operations. But the consequence is that to make our software work, we have to support every customer's environment, right? Their whatever network, whatever hardware, whatever things they're doing. And so every single person who uses the software has a unique environment. And that's a really high burden. It's one of the things that makes it, a challenge for somebody to have software and then offer it. Open source solves this problem because in some ways you transfer the onus of maintaining the unique environment back to the user. And that's great. And that actually can scale pretty well, but we've made that not work on the flip side of it. So it's sort of a challenge. And I don't want software to go away. I depend on open source software and individual creators who are maintaining tools and operational pieces and all sorts of components. It's a critical component for our industry. I think that we need to make sure we figure out how to make it work. And I think downloadable software is a critical component for how our industry works. It's not going to be a very friendly place where if the only way you can get software is by subscribing to a service and using the software that they provide the way they want to provide it. Convenient, sure, but I'm worried about the sustainability of that model and the amount of innovation that it's ultimately going to give. Because I think everybody doing, having access to their own thing and being able to modify it actually incents innovation a lot more. Services are, they're great, they're easy, but we'll see how the long-term trend lies out.
So yeah, I mean, open source is going through that, phase right now. We'll see, as you said, there may be a lot of forks and then we'll see some consolidation happen. And the good thing is that open source is very good at solving all these problems. It's just we are going into that phase where it's all is happening. And actually you're lucky, we are lucky to be going through this phase to see all of this. And we'll also see how things, finally, take shape. But once again, Rob, thank you so much for this. This is a bit hot and controversial topic, but that's something you also love. So so thank you, and I will see you again in the next show.
Excellent. Thank you, Swapnil.